Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
How did you sleep last night? Did you toss and turn, wake up several times, and have difficulty getting to sleep? And how do you feel? Tired, unrefreshed, annoyed with the world, and desperate for a coffee? Or did you wake up this morning after sleeping through the night? How do you feel? Refreshed and ready to take on the world? As we all know, a good night's sleep is something that everyone needs because we all need to be well regulated, emotionally balanced, and mentally and physically feeling great for the day ahead of us. As discussed in a previous podcast with Dr. Chris Green, sleep for infants and children and for us is really important. And today we're looking at how vital sleep is for our teens. If you're approaching the teen years with your children or sitting in the midst of them, now is the time to think about how much sleep your teenager is getting. The latest research reinforces that our teens should be getting between 8 to 10 hours of sleep. Is that happening in your household? Probably not. Teen brains are going through the second most developmental time in a child's life. We can liken it to going from a dirt road to a smooth, concreted freeway. However, as we know, this takes many years with countless potholes along the way. Teens are at even more risk than normal if they lack the sleep they need to build their new highway. I'm Kate Mason, and welcome to Parenting and Personalities. This is the podcast that connects you to the ones you care about the most. Today I'm talking to Lisa L. Lewis. Lisa is a freelance journalist, author, and public speaker. Her book, The Sleep-Deprived Teen, Why Our Teenagers Are So Tired and How Parents and Schools Can Help Them Thrive, is an extension of her previous work on the topic, including her role in helping get California's landmark legislation on healthy school start times passed. Lisa regularly presents at schools and parent groups about sleep and mental wellness connections and related topics, and has appeared on The Today Show, BBC Radio, WBUR, and many other radio and TV and podcast segments. She's written for The Washington Post, The New York Times, The Atlantic, and Time, among others. She's a parent to a late teen and a young adult who inspire much of what she writes about, everything from concussions to heat stroke to school lockdowns to teenage sleep. Lisa has a master's degree in the Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism and is an MFA from Mills College and a bachelor's degree from UC Berkeley. She lives in Southern California with her family. Hi, Lisa. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's a pleasure, and I'm really interested in how you started your life in journalism. You know, like, when did you start writing? I've read a lot of your articles that are really interesting as well. So when did your love of writing begin, and why did you use journalism as your vehicle to present your stuff to the world?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I would say I have been a writer my whole entire professional career. So we're going on, 30 years now. I did want to be a writer when I was young even. So it is interesting to see that piece worked out. I think I had also very early on wanted to be a singer and a dancer, and that part didn't work out quite so well, but but the writing path
That's
definitely.
Right, some dreams.
Yeah. Some dreams are left best unrealized, right? But yes, as a writer, I definitely had those aspirations early on, and so my entire professional career has been writing. Earlier on, it was in the corporate world, and then I've been doing journalism focused really on parenting and education and public health for about the last 15 years.
True. And so you really love investigating stuff. Like, as a person, you obviously have to have a real interest in things to gain that knowledge and search for the information.
Absolutely. And I will say, too, that so much of this has touched on my own personal life because when I mentioned that a lot of it is parenting related, well, I am a parenting journalist. I'm also a parent. I have 2 kids. One is 18 and one is 22. And over the years, so many of the topics that I've written about really have stemmed from personal interest and personal experience. Not all of them, of course, but for a great many topics. And in fact, the one we're going to be talking about today, sleep, absolutely ties back to my experience as a parent and my son's experience when he was starting high school.
Yeah, it is. It is really interesting, isn't it? What we're interested in as we go through our life as parents is what we're interested in before. None of that would have even been appealing. So what prompted you to write The Sleep-Deprived Teen? What was happening in your life at the time that you thought, oh my goodness, I really need to research this?
Yeah. So my book, The Sleep-Deprived Teen, came out last year, 2022, and it actually was the outgrowth of my immersion in this topic of adolescent sleep over the last, at that point, 7 years, as of right now, 8 years, because it all dates back to 2015, which is when my oldest of my 2 kids, my son, was entering high school. So as I mentioned, that really was the catalyst that got me involved in and interested in this issue of teen sleep. Specifically, initially looking at school start times. And that's because at that point, when he was starting his freshman year, our local public high school in California started at 7:30 in the morning. And that's incredibly early. You know, yes, some people are morning people. I'm certainly not. He certainly wasn't. And what I quickly realized as I started delving into the issue is most teens are not morning people, and 7:30 is indeed too early. So I initially started looking into it because we had this very early start time. It was very quickly obvious that it was not a good fit for him. For me, as the person driving him to school every day, we'd leave our house at 7:10, and he was sitting there in the passenger seat, and he was technically awake, but hardly ready to go off, alert and primed for a full day of learning. And so I did start looking into the issue to figure out, well, why does our school start at 7:30? And are we an anomaly? Is this common in other school districts too? And is this okay to be doing? And I quickly found out that we were not alone, and that 7:30 was indeed too early. So again, this was back in 2015. So here in the United States, the previous year, 2014, the American Academy of Pediatrics had just released a policy statement on school start times. And their recommendation was that middle and high schools should start no earlier than 8:30 because of the link between these very early start times and teen sleep deprivation, and then all of the ramifications of that. So that's what initially got me involved in this issue, and then I continued to write about it. One of my articles was an op-ed that ran in the Los Angeles Times, and it happened to be read by one of our California state senators who also had a teenager in high school, and it just so happened that their high school was having this same discussion about start times. So he literally read my op-ed in the newspaper, and it struck a chord with him, and because this was something that was already percolating in his life, and he decided this was an issue worthy of further investigation, that he wanted his office to look into it more. He was interested in perhaps introducing a bill on the topic. That's what ended up happening. I got looped into that even before that bill was officially introduced, ended up testifying at our state capitol, involved in this 2.5-year journey, and resulted in our state law in California setting minimum allowed start times for middle and high schools. First state in the United States to enact this law. And then, as a result of my involvement in that, and all of this information I've gathered, I've just been steeped in for the last several years, that's what led to my book, The Sleep-Deprived Teen.
Wow, what a background. That is massive, and what a massive achievement for you, and to have successfully done something like that at such a high level of government and ordinance in California as such.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's all I can say. That is an amazing thing. So because like I was saying to you earlier, in Australia, most of our start times are 8:30. We currently in Adelaide, where I am, have high school testing 9:30 start times with their middle and senior kids. So that's currently a trial that's running. But yes, as most of us know, when our kids hit the teens, it's not like they're early birds anymore. In fact, I loved it because my son always got up at 6:30 and it was always too early for me and it drove me nuts. So when he became a teenager and slept into 11 on weekends, I was like,
oh my goodness, same.
But when it comes... You're like, oh, really, this is amazing. But for them, like you say, and I'm going to get you to explain in a minute, their whole sleep cycle is suddenly changing. And so therefore it makes it even harder for them to get out of bed. So the sleep times that you're talking about, getting a child out of bed to go to school, must have been terrible. And it must still be terrible in the States if this is what's continuing in other different states of the United States as such. So let's get started on what happens to the cycle of sleep for the teenager. What are the 4 stages of it? And, you know, when that teen brain hits puberty and explodes once again.
Yes,
tell us
absolutely.
all about that.
So there's so much to say about sleep. So I'm just going to kind of give the quick overview. But it really is important. When you think about it, we spend a third of our lives asleep. So, you know, this is obviously a pretty important aspect of our lives, or you know, we wouldn't be programmed to be spending that much of it literally asleep in our beds. So all of us, including teens, cycle through these different stages of sleep every night. But what happens with teens is the most significant difference has to do with the timing of their sleep schedule, which does indeed shift later, as you were just mentioning. So what happens is that, you know, when our kids are young, as you noted, and I had a son who was just like that, bounded out of bed every day at 6:30 in the morning. Mm-hmm. You know, little kids, they do that, they play hard all day, and then they easily fall asleep at, 7:30 or 8. Well, all of a sudden that same kid hits the teen years, and that's not the case anymore. They are not getting up anywhere near 6:30 in the morning willingly. And that has to do with what's called a circadian rhythm shift. Basically, their entire sleep-wake schedule shifts later. And this is actually biologically based. So this, again, sleep is a very complex process, but part of it is, we sort of build up this sleep pressure over the course of the day. The longer we've been awake, the more we're building up this pressure. However, there's also a circadian rhythm. So it's sort of this up and down of natural times when we feel awake and when we feel sleepy. So that feeling of sleepiness at night is also prompted by the release of melatonin. That's the hormone that primes us to feel sleepy. And so what happens is at adolescence, as our kids hit adolescence, melatonin begins to be released later in the evening. And so they're not feeling sleepy as early as they used to. So generally speaking, they're not feeling sleepy until about 11 o'clock at night. And then, of course, we know in so many cases, teens aren't getting to bed anywhere close to 11, but they're not going to be able to fall asleep earlier, like at, say, 9 o'clock. That's just not going to happen. You could put a teen to bed at 9 o'clock, but they would just lay there and stare at the ceiling because they're not feeling sleepy. So they're not feeling sleepy till later in the evening because of this later release of melatonin. Well, on the other end, the melatonin also is no longer subsides as early in the morning as it used to. So that's why they sleep in. So it's like that whole cycle has shifted later bedtimes, later wake times. In addition, teens need more sleep than we do as adults because they're still growing. So they still need, up until they hit age 18, they should be getting 8 to 10 hours of sleep every single night. So if you just do the math, they're not sleepy till about 11, or they get to bed even later than that. And then they need 8 to 10 hours of sleep. So you can see if they get woken too early in the morning, most often that's because of, they have to for school, then they're not able to get enough sleep. And then that plays into this whole issue of teen sleep deprivation.
And as without that knowledge behind us, often we assume that they don't actually need as much sleep as before because they are going to sleep later, and we do get them up and they're grumpy and whatever. But there was never before this, a lot of research that was done to let us know that actually they still need lots of sleep. So really as we have no hope of getting them to sleep at 11, you're right, we need to try and extend the sleep on the other side of the spectrum. So what is actually happening to that teen brain when you hit puberty? I love your bit about talking about pruning and remodeling of brain cells, which is really interesting because, it happens when they're very young. It's not necessarily the pruning, it's the growing of the brain cells. And I just think about old age as well. There's a lot of pruning of brain cells in old people, but not necessarily remodeling. So when the teen cells are happening like that, what's happening in the brain?
Yeah. Well, there's so much going on, when our kids are growing, and certainly when our teens are growing, you see them just morphing, literally from children into adults. You see it on the outside, but there's so much going on beneath the surface as well. So definitely when it comes to brain development, the adolescent years are a major phase of brain development, and it is focused on those two processes you just mentioned, pruning and remodeling. So the pruning piece has to do with pruning away the excess brain cells, because there's an overabundance created when the brain is first formed. And then pruning away that excess is what allows the remaining brain cells to function more effectively. So that's taking place over the course of adolescence. The other key piece is the remodeling piece, and that has to do with strengthening the connectivity between the brain cells, between the neurons, for faster and more effective processing. So all of this is a multi-year process. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens over the course of adolescence and even stretches into early adulthood. But it's a fairly dramatic improvement in terms of processing. One of the neuroscientists that I interviewed for the book compared this process to, likened it to upgrading from a dirt road to a paved freeway.
Okay.
So just to give you a sense of, the magnitude of what we're talking about here. And again, it's going on over this period of many years. But when it's all finally complete and our teens do have their fully mature brains, they're able to behave less impulsively, they can focus their attention more effectively, and they can make better decisions.
But in the meantime, there's a whole lot of potholes sitting there in that road, I guess, as you head out that way.
Absolutely.
and sleep deprivation.
That's a great way to put it.
And sleep deprivation, as we know, when we're deprived of sleep, we're grumpy. We're often need a lot of coffee. We can't think as fast. So for teenagers, when they're deprived of sleep, the scary thing about this is when you're talking about suicidal rates and things like that, this is the period of time where most suicides do occur, according to your research, in a sense. So what's happening for our teenagers during this time that creates that with that lack of sleep?
Yeah, such an important point, because for all of us, adults too, when we are sleep deprived, we have less emotional resiliency. We have less of an emotional buffer for dealing with life, for dealing with just the daily stressors. It exacerbates symptoms of mental health issues across the board: anxiety, depression, suicidality. But you're right, for teens, this is especially a concern. And there's a couple of reasons. Number one, we know mental health issues already have been rising among teens these last several years, just, against the backdrop of what's been going on. In fact, I just pulled some data for Australia looking to see, some current numbers. And it looked like just earlier this year from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, some data that was released showed that among essentially teens and young adults, ages 16 through 24, almost 40% had experienced a mental disorder within the past year. And this included anxiety, mood, depression, as well as substance use. But anxiety specifically was the most common. Almost a third reporting that they had experienced anxiety in the last year. So this is already prevalent, and especially so among this age group. But then when you layer in the fact that teens themselves don't have essentially these fully developed brains that we do as adults. So
Yep.
let me step back a bit. So when we are sleep deprived, all of us feel emotions more intensely. Our emotions run hotter. We just feel things more intensely. That sense of sort of being grumpy, being crabby when we haven't gotten enough sleep. So we all feel that. But we as adults, we've got that piece, but we also have a fully mature prefrontal cortex, which is the sort of seat of executive functioning. And that's what provides the rational decision making. That's what provides sort of that counterbalance to that increased emotional state that we can find ourselves in when we haven't got enough sleep. Our teens don't yet have that counterbalance in place to the same degree that we do as adults. And so they do feel this sort of these effects more so than we do. And then, of course, as I was mentioning, then when we're sleep deprived, it exacerbates even more so all of these mental health issues, which, again, our teens already were facing given the pandemic, given everything that's gone on. So it really is sort of one of those almost straightforward fixes, which is focusing on getting enough sleep really can help in so many ways. It does not solve mental health issues, but it's sort of the low-hanging fruit. Like that's sort of the first piece you can look at. Well, are you getting enough sleep? Because that alone, when you wake up and you've got enough sleep, everything seems easier.
It does. And unfortunately, trying to tell a teenager that is another thing altogether, bit tricky. With all of this searching, your knowledge that you have around it, what kind of advice can you give parents about their emotional teenager and getting sleep? And did anything work for you?
Well, I will say, first of all, that it was an ongoing process. It certainly was not a one and done. And even the fact that I was immersed in all this research and, had like real, new data to cite and, all this information I could share. It wasn't as if they were so impressed with it that they just wanted to take the information I gave them and ran with it and said, "Oh, great, Mom. Thanks so much. That's so helpful." Didn't quite work out that way. That being said, though, I think one of the main messages is really to make sleep a family priority.
Right.
So that having them know it's not just something that you are expecting them to do. It's something that we as parents ideally are modeling too, both because we're setting a good example, but also because we are prioritizing our own sleep, which helps us, across the board, because again, sleep affects our outlook on life. It affects how we are in the world. It certainly affects, our ability to be patient when we're having interactions with teens. If you've got a sleep deprived parent and a sleep deprived teen, that's not really a recipe for, great communication.
No, not a good time.
No. So setting a good example helps, and having these ongoing conversations about it and modeling behaviors. So things like encouraging our teens, and then also for ourselves to have a wind down routine before bed. So it's something, that really should involve ideally logging off of tech devices. So again, for us as adults, getting off our phones, and also encouraging our teens to do so, ideally an hour before bedtime. And we can talk more about tech use if you want, but basically getting off and starting to transition into more of a I'm getting ready to go to sleep frame of mind. And so, that's what can you do to wind down? And for us as adults, scrolling and reading the latest world news headlines is not helping us wind down.
No.
For our kids, being online, doing their homework up until the last second, or being online engaged in some sort of emotional chat with their friends, not helping them disengage from the day and wind down. So instead, it's, unplug, ideally get the phones out of the bedrooms. And this too is where as parents, if we're saying something like, hey, your phone needs to come out of the bedroom, needs to be charged in the kitchen. Well, we too should have our phones being charged right next to theirs in the kitchen. And then instead of, doing that right before you turn out the light, it's something else. It's taking a warm bath. It's reading a book. It's, stretching. It's whatever it is that you can do that is not being engaged online and then expecting you can turn off the light and immediately fall right asleep, because it doesn't quite work that way.
And was this stuff you learned after the event, or did you manage to put it in place? Because I always say too, when I'm talking to parents, the earlier you get in with this stuff, the easier it is. Because look, when my children were younger, I've got another 8 years on you, so phones were not as overwhelmingly in your lives as they were now, as they are currently rather. And so we didn't have to do that. We just the kids didn't have phones in their room. I just started that anyway. It wasn't something they carried naturally with them to bed. However, nowadays, yes, we do, and exactly the situation you're in, but my children are adults, so I don't have to fend that off. Because modelling it is really hard as adults too. But our kids, as you know, with adult children really do copy the stuff that you do, and sometimes you don't realise until they are adults. So like you say, modelling it is really important. Then they can't argue with you and say, well, you don't do it either, or never see you do that with your phone. And if my brother and sister-in-law had younger children, and until recently they were right on to that plan. They always put their phones in the kitchen. Everyone had to have their phones out, and they were wondering why I think she was a 16-year-old daughter was quite happy putting her phone out each night, because she kicked up a bit of a ruckus for a while. And then they worked out one night she bought a second phone, and she was actually using that phone in her bedroom at night. So, just a little heads up for anyone that might try that, and it might be different. But like you say, getting all of these things and getting your bedtime preparation, we do it when they're little, like you said in your book, we prepare them for bed, we give them bath time, story time. And as we get older, the same prep does need to be as part of our bedtime routines. And teenagers often don't have that. And so I do agree with you. I think that is a really important thing. If you're listening and you have teens, or you know someone with teens, I think that's very important in that sense.
Yeah. And to your point, it is something that has just proliferated, over the last decade or so, just tech use. I agree. I think my sister has younger kids. And so the tech has they've had tech rules in place all along, because tech has existed the whole time her kids have been growing up. Whereas to your point, it wasn't as big of a factor when my kids were very little, and thank goodness for that. So in a way, I don't know which is easier. I mean, it just is. We just have to, there's no going back at this point. Obviously, like, tech is here to stay. It has permeated all of our lives. I should also mention that tech is not universally bad. I mean, the fact that our teens today are using social media and staying engaged with their friends online, that's a key part of how they maintain those friendships. It's just, the technology itself has changed. When I was in high school, it was the telephone. I would spend hours on the telephone. That's how I stayed in touch with my friend. Well, teens today don't particularly like talking on the phone, but social media and that, and staying in touch with their friends through online means actually does have a valid role in their lives. However, of course, it can quickly become problematic, both in terms of, that's a whole other discussion in terms of the types of pitfalls to be aware of, but also the fact that when they are online, especially late at night, the impact it can have on their sleep. And so for parents whose kids have grown up with technology, they likely have had these kind of tech rules in place all along, which does make it easier as they hit the teen years. And for those who haven't, your teens are still at a point where they're at home and you do have some oversight of what's going on. Ultimately, when they leave home, they're going to have to be responsible for this themselves. So we're not going to be able to help them once they're living in their own apartment. But while they're at home, even if there haven't been tech rules in place, you can still do that. But that's where it isn't just sort of like enforcing rules. It's having these conversations and having them kind of help determine what are the issues that they're having and what kind of solutions do they think might help. Because somebody who's sleep deprived generally knows it. They know if they're dragging and they feel like they wish they could get more sleep, and they may, especially if you have a teen, broaching the topic and talking about it is probably a great first step if that hasn't yet happened.
It is. And I know that a lot of people that I interview talk about get curious, ask your kid. you're feeling tired. What can you do about it? Often as parents, we tend to just assume that we know everything and we can fix it for them. But really asking the question is a really interesting thing. I think that's a great first step, is often to say, you're feeling tired. What can you do about it? What can we help you with? Because very often we're assuming we know what to do and how to help. That's part of a different conversation. Once again, communication in that sense of keeping it up with your children and keeping in contact with how they're feeling about everything, which is very much about that mental health area too, is actually staying in contact with how they feel too. But getting back to sleep deprivation, just one more quick thing I just want to touch on is that at this stage, teens, you say, are more prone to addiction because they're pruning and they're using and pruning, and the brain is now learning things that are being reinforced. So just a quick, tell us about food and drink and addiction.
Yeah, so it's interesting because, again, getting back to the teen brain. So the first part of the brain that kind of revs up is the part responsible for sort of risk-taking and sensation-seeking. I mean, so teens already are primed for that. And yet they don't have the executive functioning in place at the same level. That sort of braking system has not yet come online. So they are more primed to take risks. And to seek out, new novel experiences, et cetera. So when it comes to addiction, obviously that can play into that. When you layer in sleep deprivation, the barrier for impulsive behaviors also lowers even further. And then getting back to the brain development piece, that whole aspect of pruning we were talking about, which is essentially use it or lose it. The fact that the brain cells that are being used the most develop the strongest connections. Those that aren't being used get pruned away. Well, so when it comes to addictive behaviors, they're using those brain cells and developing and strengthening those pathways, which, of course, then has implications for future potential addiction. And in fact, the research shows that, particularly for teens, as sleep deprivation goes down, their odds for a range of risky behaviors increase. So it does include things like substance use, but it includes other risky behaviors, things like wearing a seatbelt when driving. That tends to go down as they get less sleep. So just across the board, there is absolutely, there's two pieces. The fact is that teens are already more prone to risky behaviors, and then the piece of sleep deprivation being layered on top of that, which just further exacerbates that.
Yeah. So as we leave, do you have a couple of actionable advice pieces that you could give to parents or teenagers or people listening where they could first start on trying to get their teen or more sleep?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's really two parts of the equation. One is what time they go to bed, and the other is what time they wake up. So it sounds like in many cases, your listeners, if they're in Australia, their teens, are not having to go to school at 7:30 in the morning, which thank goodness for that. That means ideally they're not having to wake, at the crack of dawn. So then often it really is looking at what's going on in the home at night in terms of them getting to bed at a reasonable hour. So that's why I had mentioned earlier, they're not feeling sleepy until about 11 o'clock, but then, of course, some of them are going to bed far later than that. So it's looking at what are those reasons that are playing into them going to bed super late, if that's an issue. It's helping them with things like disengaging from tech so that they can wind down, but it's also looking at what else they have going on that may be keeping them up late. Sometimes it's looking at things like overscheduling. Maybe they're up late because they have so much to do because of their homework load coupled with all the extracurriculars they have going on. So the best first step is probably just kind of assessing the situation and trying to figure out, well, what are the factors playing into that? If they are consistently getting to bed so late that they are not able to get, that ideal range of 8 to 10 hours, having a conversation with them about what those factors are, brainstorming what are some ways to address it. But then really just trying to keep that collaborative mindset, because as you mentioned, that whole in the spirit of being curious and having this be a conversation and having them provide input and sort of trying together to help figure out what are some ways that might help.
Thank you so much for your time today, Lisa. It's wonderful. You have so much knowledge now, and what you've achieved and accomplished is amazing. Can you tell people where they can find you?
Yes. And thank you so much for those kind words. So my website is www.lisalewis.com. I do use my middle initial L, just because Lisa Lewis is somewhat of a common name, and the book is The Sleep Deprived Teen.
Excellent. And once again, thank you very much. And if anyone needs to get in contact, you've got the details and they'll be in the show notes. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much.
So, having listened to Lisa, there are 3 tips to explore the suggestions of supporting a well-being of your teenager, fostering their emotional and physical resilience during their teen years. Number 1, get curious. Ask questions about their sleep, what they can do, and what you can do. Number 2, start a nighttime routine with electronic devices as a family. Model the behaviours that you want from your teenagers. Number 3, look at their schedules. How much are they doing? Are there areas in their life, such as work, sport, or homework, where they could cut back and use this as sleep time? When teens sleep well, they're easy to live with, as we all are. If you're listening and don't have teens, you could share this podcast with someone who does. Knowledge is power. I'm Kate Mason. Thank you for listening to Parenting and Personalities. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you could leave a rating and a review that would help others learn about the podcast. If you're interested in discovering more about you and your family's personality types, you'll find my book, Who Is This Monster or Treasure in My House, on Booktopia or Amazon. If you have an episode idea, please send a note to thepersonalitycoach@gmail.com. Many thanks to our producers at Stories and Strategies, and we'll see you next time.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.